Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. I'm Nick Park and I'm taking us through these series of 5-minute messages on dinner with Jesus. We're looking at times whenever Jesus ate with other people and what took place there, the teachings that were shared. And sometimes it was in a formal dinner setting. Sometimes it was walking through the cornfields with his disciples. Sometimes it was at a wedding feast. And even last time we looked at the feeding of the 5,000. It was out in the open with a big crowd of people. And actually today we're looking at a similar event, which is the feeding of the 4,000. Because, of course, the Bible speaks about both of them. All four Gospels share about the feeding of the 5,000. But then Matthew and Mark, in Matthew 15 and Mark 8, also share about the incident when Jesus fed the 4,000. And I'll be honest with you, it's not a miracle that we actually talk an awful lot. Because if you're going to talk about miraculous multiplication, you're probably going to go for the bigger miracle. And so I'll be honest with you, I'm a pastor. I've been in full-time ministry for now, going on 40 years, and I have never preached on the feeding of the 4,000. I've preached on the feeding of the 5,000 many times because, you know what, you're going to make a deal of the bigger miracle rather than the smaller one. That's similar, aren't you? You know what, it's just like you'd rather make a fuss of somebody for being a gold medal winner in the Olympics than winning the silver medal. And so the 4,000 looks like the silver medal to the gold medal of the feeding of the 5,000. So why would the Gospels record both of them? Well, there are differences here. The feeding of the 5,000, it was mainly to Jews. The feeding of the 5,000, if you remember, Jesus went on the boat to a lonely place, but all the people from the area around Capernaum and everything else followed round the edge of the Sea of Galilee to make it there and be there. So it was among Jews. It was out in a lonely place, but it was the people who came from where Jesus was living and ministering at that time. Whereas the feeding of the 4,000 took place in the region of Decapolis, the 10 cities, and that was more where Gentiles lived. The feeding of the 5,000 involved 5 loaves and 2 fishes. The feeding of the 4,000 involved 7 loaves and a few fishes. And with the feeding of the 5,000, there was 12 baskets left over. With the feeding of the 4,000, there were 7 baskets left over. So again, in purely terms of quantity, you understand the feeding of the 5,000, more people were fed from less loaves and more baskets were gathered afterwards. So yeah, it is more impressive. But we need to think about where this second miracle took place. The feeding of the 4,000 took place in the Decapolis. This was the same region, the region of the Gadarenes. This was where, if you remember before, Jesus had crossed over to heal a demoniac man, a man possessed by demons. And the demons had been cast out, went into the pigs. The pigs basically all committed mass suicide, jumping into the ocean and drowning, into the Sea of Galilee and drowning. And the locals came along, saw what had happened, and instead of being impressed by the miracle, said, please leave this place. And Jesus left that place. And I've often thought they preferred pigs over miracles. You know, they could have had so much blessing, so much healing, so much everything else, but they said, Jesus, please leave this place. And sometimes we say that's like the end of the story, but it's not, because the feeding of the 4,000 says Jesus came back again. And Jesus gave them another miracle, even though they had rejected him and asked him to go. And yes, Jesus came primarily, and when he first came, it was initially he came to the Jews. So the feeding of the 5,000 was for the Jews. But the Gentiles were not left out, because then there was the feeding of the 4,000 for the Gentiles, and even coming back to the same people who had rejected him before. So the feeding of the 4,000 speaks to us of God sharing the gospel beyond Israel. The sharing of the gospel with Israel was only to be a preparation for the gospel going to the entire world, and Israel could fill what was always its God-given calling, to be a light to the Gentiles. But the feeding of the 4,000 speaks about people getting a second chance. Even the people that rejected Jesus and asked him to leave them, he came back to them again in mercy. But the feeding of the 4,000 also speaks of God's perfection and fullness. Because I'm not one of these persons who likes to give all kind of meanings out of numbers and adding them all up and doing theological arithmetic. But nevertheless, we do know that the number 7 is the number of God's completeness. And here with 4,000 people were fed with 7 loaves. There were 7 baskets of food left over. And I think the implication that we're supposed to take from that is very clear indeed, that God reaches out to all people. He gives us a second chance. And even when God comes to us with that second chance, he still does everything perfectly to open the way up for us to find Jesus and find eternal life. And I would encourage you today, if you have loved ones that have rejected Jesus and because of that you despair they're ever going to come to know him, you know what? Jesus can speak to them again. Still keep praying for them. Still keep sharing the gospel with them, because Jesus will give them a second chance. And that second chance will be a perfect opportunity for them to come to Jesus for themselves. May God bless you today. Join us again tomorrow for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.